Hi, everybody, and welcome to ZTV Live. Today's Tuesday, November 3rd, Election Day. Hopefully, everybody got out to vote. I'm sure you heard a hint or two, or a tip, or a nudge somewhere along your day for the last 6 months. Today's the last day to do it, and I believe on the East Coast the polls are closing right about now. Anyway, tonight we are back for Reading, Writing, and Ralph, and Ralph Peluso is back with his wonderful show. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and bring Ralph on screen. Ralph, welcome back. How are you today?
Great, Susan. How are you doing on this wonderful election day?
I'm doing amazingly. I'm doing great. And so I'm as anxious as everybody else to see the results of the election. So
I know a lot of my friends and neighbors were out there because they were at the polls bright and early as we were, and got through pretty quickly. And I thought about going back again to vote a few more times, but they wouldn't let me.
I know they're kind of sticklers about that, aren't they?
Yeah, they did. When I was in Chicago, it was different, but here I can't do it, so I don't
Yeah,
know.
right. Oh, that's a good one.
But anyway, we've got a wonderful guest tonight, Ric Murphy, noted historian.
Mm-hmm.
He wrote a nonfiction about the first African Americans to arrive in Virginia, and I read it, and it was quite eye-opening, filled with a lot of information about history. Maybe some of us knew and some of us didn't. So
Great.
it's going to be a good show.
Terrific. I'm bringing Ric up on the screen right now. Ric Murphy, hello. Welcome to ZTV Live.
Hi guys, how you doing?
We're doing great. How are you doing?
Good, thanks.
Good. Ralph, I'm going to let you take it away.
Thanks. So, Ric, welcome to the show. So glad
Thank
to
you.
have you. And I have to admit that it was a very a rewarding experience. The book I read it, as you know, and I found it interesting and very enlightening. So,
Thank
but
you.
as I always I'd like you to tell our viewers a little bit about yourself and your background. And so, go ahead.
Well, I'm a Boston native. I live in the Washington, D.C. area. I'm an educator by training, a businessman by vocation, a historian by curiosity, and a genealogist by birth. So I like to consider myself a man that for all seasons.
Wow, that's quite a mouthful. I'm glad you mentioned you were from Boston because we have a shared experience about baseball
That's right.
and our grandfathers.
That's
Now,
right.
my experience with my grandfather, he was typical Italian. He'd come home, he'd sit in a chair, he'd be very quiet. And on Friday nights, he always invited me up to watch the New York Giants on WOR TV. And I did that for years, from the time I was about 6 until I was 15 or 16 years old. Wonderful days. So tell the audience about your experience, because it's very fascinating as well.
Well, my grandfather was a true Boston Red Sox fan. Somewhere along the line, someone gave him a small red transistor radio. And during the summer months, he would sit either out back with the mosquitoes or on the screen porch and have his transistor in his left pocket and his little ear plug in his right ear. And none of us could bother him while he listened to his beloved Boston Red Sox. And unfortunately, he did not live long enough to see the Red Sox win the World Series. But I know somewhere up there, he was smiling down on all of us.
Great. Now, did your grandfather have the opportunity to see Babe Ruth play?
Yes, he did.
So did mine.
And
Yeah.
he was always hoping that the Red Sox would beat the Yankees, which was supposed to be his gift to us as grandchildren for Babe Ruth leaving the Red Sox and going to the Yankees. So he was part of that old timer feeling that he shouldn't have left us. But I think that kind of made the game a very interesting game.
Right. Yeah. Well, it makes it interesting for families. I tell you that much.
Absolutely.
As you would know. So anyway, tell us how you came about writing this book, The First African Americans in Virginia. What led you to it, and what you like the readers to walk away with and gain their experience from this.
Well, what's interesting about my family, and I've always heard over the years stories about different things from the family through oral family history. And one of the things that I learned very early on, that I descended from 13 men of African descent who served in the Revolutionary War. So even as a young child, we learned an awful lot about our family history. And part of that is I knew as a young child that my African ancestors arrived on these shores in 1619, and I learned that my European ancestors arrived on these shores in 1642. So that was something that I learned as a very young child. And as an author, I like to write about African American history. I like to write about those that we know very little about. So this particular book, I really wanted to learn more about my African ancestors, my Angolan ancestors, who came here in 1619. I wanted to know where they came from. I wanted to know the circumstances that brought them here. I understood that the family owned thousands and thousands of acres of land. And as you know, most of us, that's a phenomenon that we can't quite put our hands around, that families would pass down thousands and thousands of acres of land over a 400-year period. So I had a lot of questions that I wanted to have answers. So I did the research, and that's what brought me to the book, The First Africans in Virginia.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And let's talk a little bit about the Angolans back then and their history and their culture and their caste systems, and why it was ripe that they were taken, I guess, by the Portuguese, if I remember correctly, and sent over to the New World.
Well, a couple of things. First, in 1493, the Pope, and I think you might see a world map, the Spanish and the Portuguese, who were the original colonizers, were fighting each other around the world based on where their ships would land. And they developed a rather long lasted dispute, and both being Catholic nations, the Pope didn't want them to go to war because they both were in the Iberian Peninsula, and that would not be a fantastic war to see. So he divided the world in half. The Portuguese got everything to the west of a line, east of a line, and the Spanish got everything to the west of the line. So based on that, the Portuguese became the colonizers of Africa. So in 1493, the Portuguese discovered the Angolan kingdom and began to realize that the kingdom was very much like the kingdom that they came from in Portugal. The streets were laid out the same. Their culture was pretty much the same. Their history in terms of how they manage their governments. They also had kings over in Africa. So the Portuguese and the Angolans had conducted business about 125 years successfully. The Pope was so impressed with how the Angolan nation converted to Catholicism that many of the royal citizens sent their sons off to Europe to be educated. So they were educated in Spain, they were educated in Portugal, they were even educated in Rome, in the Vatican, because many of them came back to be priests and bishops. It wasn't until 1618 that the Portuguese discovered that the royal city of Cabaça sat on top of a silver mine. And from that point forward, that good merchant relationship soured when the Portuguese wanted to colonize that particular area where the royal citizens lived. And that started the whole story of 1619 in terms of the capture of the royal citizens. The caste system in Africa, particularly in Angola, was no different than the caste system in Europe. And we kind of forget that Europe in the late 1500s and the early 1600s was not as developed as we come to think of it today. So their caste system was not much different in Europe than the way that it was in Angola. In fact, in Europe, when warlords went to battle, they would capture the local people, they would enslave them, and over time they would assimilate them. And that's pretty much what they did in Angola as well. When they went to battle, they captured the local people, and then they eventually assimilated them, which is a form of slavery very different than what we've come to know here in the United States, particularly during the antebellum period.
Yeah. But the one fascinating thing, if we're going to loop back to the Pope dividing the world, because the continents aren't exactly straight up and down,
That's correct.
is that's how Brazil ended up being Portuguese, even though the rest of South America, for the most part, is Spanish.
That's correct. So if you look at the map, you'll notice that Portugal was on the eastern part of that dividing line, and that's why Portugal was the colonizer of Brazil, and that's why Brazilians even today speak Portuguese.
Right. Now the role of the Vatican in this was pretty significant, and I think in your book you used the term papal bull, which not many folks know about. We've heard that term being a Catholic, so why don't you explain papal bull to the viewers?
Well, the papal bull, in fact, was the actual written document that the Pope had the two kings from Portugal and Spain sign as an agreement that they would divide the world in half. So from that papal bull, Spain believed they owned everything to the west of that line, including the people, and Portugal believed it owned everything, including the land and the people, to the right. So when you begin to realize that the whole concept of colonization and ownership derived from that papal bull, which was something that the Vatican had signed between those two governments, and that was done specifically to try to prevent them from going to war.
Yeah. But I just found it funny, the term papal bull, and it's used as a document to basically, it was almost like bullying rather than, if somebody said to me that's bull today, I would think something totally different.
Well, maybe that's where the term that we come to use it today came from.
It probably is.
That I did not research. So, Ralph, I think that's going to be my next project, to research that.
There you go. I'd love that. And you go like, yeah, papal bull. Now, if somebody's go to church on Sunday, I could ask the priest about that and see what his thought is. But anyway, we do 3 trivia questions, so it's a good time to do the first one. We have a very engaging audience, and so the first trivia question is, who is recognized as the first African-American child born in the colonies? So, and as soon as we get the first correct answer, I'll get the high sign from Susan, and we'll announce it. Now, tonight we're going to do something a little bit different. So when we get to the second and third, if we have a previous winner, we're gonna announce them as having gotten the answer right, but we're gonna give the book away to the second or the third person, depending on whether it's the second or third question. So anyway, so that's the first trivia question for tonight. So the culture is great, and then we get this ship that leaves Angola. Portuguese ship, I think, right? And it heads west, and it's got a sister ship with it, and then tell the experience and what happened on that ship's path to the New World.
Well, when Portugal discovered the silver under the royal city of Cabaça, during that very small window, Portugal and Spain actually were ruled by the same king, and it was part of the Iberian Peninsula. They sent 36 ships loaded with soldiers and heavy armament to Angola to take over the royal city. The Portuguese and the Spaniards began to realize that the fortune of these colonies was the minerals that they had. The last ship to arrive was a newly acquired ship called the San Juan Bautista. Now, perhaps one of your trivial questions should have been, where was the San Juan Bautista built? It was actually a Japanese ship. It was built in Japan. And I think you've got a picture of that, and if that could come up to show your audience, number one, you can see how small this ship was. But when the Emperor of Japan was interested in Christianity, he had the ship built on Spanish specs, traveled the world, decided he didn't want Christianity, and sold the ship to Spain to be part of the Spanish Armada. So it was one of the last, if not the last ship to arrive, and was at port. When the Angolans were captured, 2,000 of them, The first ones to be captured were the Royals. They were marched 100 miles to Luna, Angola. 350 of them were put on the San Juan Bautista as enslaved men, women, and children, and they were destined to go to Veracruz, New Spain, which is present-day Mexico. En route, they stopped in Jamaica, and from Jamaica, 500 miles off the coast of New Spain, present-day Mexico, they were attacked by 2 pirate ships. Now, what's interesting is the world was divided in half for Spain and Portugal, and they became very, very wealthy as colonizers by stripping the minerals. England did not, at this point in time, have any role in this game. So they felt the only way they could make their wealth was to attack the Spanish and the Portuguese ships, and that's what they did with the San Juan Bautista. For whatever the reason, they weren't paying attention because the ship wasn't leaving New Spain, Mexico. It was going to New Spain. So instead of having silver and gold on this ship, it had approximately 300 hungry, tired, sick Angolans on board. 2 hours, the 2 ships fought the Spanish enslaver. They took the 60 healthiest men, women, and children, and they headed back to Virginia, which was an English colony in America. And that started a huge battle between Spain and England, who just came off of a huge 14-year war battle. They were in a treaty, and England now broke that treaty by the pirating of that San Juan Bautista.
Yeah, didn't they? If I remember correctly, that they split them up, like half went to one port and half went to I guess it was Jamestown.
Well, what they did was the 2 captains took the 60 healthiest and they literally split them in half. So 30 was on the White Lion, an English ship, and 30 were on the Treasurer. So they did split them up. And we're able to track the numbers based on how many arrived in Virginia at Point Comfort, present-day Hampton, Virginia, and those that eventually arrived in Bermuda. So the number was 60.
Yep. So, and then when they arrived, and I think you and I talked about this, there's some debate as to what their status was, because they weren't slaves and they weren't contraband. So why don't you discuss a little bit about that, because I thought that was fascinating.
Well, you're absolutely correct. History has always written that every African who came to these shores, in fact, were enslaved Africans. And that's not the case with these particular Africans because, number one, the laws of slavery did not exist in English America during that period of time. England never thought about Africans as being enslaved, primarily because they had all of the free, cheap labor that they wanted, because England was filled with English peasants, and they wanted to use these English peasants as the labor force in the New World in the Americas. So when these Africans arrived, based on all of the colonial documents that were out there, they were not enslaved. In fact, they were treated as servants. One of the main reasons that they weren't enslaved, as I mentioned previously, England did not want to go to war with Spain over the capture of these 60 Angolans. More important, the Spanish ambassador clearly stated that he wanted to have some kind of financial amends for the captured ship and the pirated ship. And the pirate ship was captained by a gentleman by the name of Captain Acuna, who in fact happened to be a cousin of the ambassador to the Spanish ambassador to England. So it really wasn't worth these 2 great, powerful nations going to war over 60 Angolans. So they were not treated as slaves. In fact, most of them wound up owing substantial amount of land during their lifetime, and we know that through the colonial records. And it's absolutely amazing how these colonial records have been preserved. Now, because of the legal challenges around these Angolans, and it's hard for folks to get their heads wrapped around this, but these 60 Angolans are documented in Angola, they're documented in Jamaica, they're documented in Bermuda, they're documented in Mexico, they're documented in England, they're documented in Spain, they're documented in Portugal, and they're also found in the documents in the Vatican. So it's unbelievable that these 60 Angolans are documented in so many different places, and one of the key places that they're documented is in the Virginia archives here in Virginia. So I don't know why for 400 years nobody knew anything about these 60 Angolans when the documentation is over so many different continents and so many different national archives around the world. And that's specifically because the fear was that England and Spain were going to go into a major world war, and nobody wanted that to happen.
Wow. Yeah, it's interesting because, you know, as you stated earlier, the way history is taught, every African American that came over was a slave, and here from the outset, it wasn't that case. And the Angolans played a very unique and powerful role in the development of the colonies, and we'll talk about that in a second. I just want to see if we have a winner yet. So, Susan, do we have a winner?
We sure do have a winner, and it was very close. Michelle D'Amato came out with the full name correctly. She was right in between Kelly McConomy, our second winner, who said William, and then Michelle said William Tucker, and then Kelly said Tucker. So it was a by a nose.
Now Michelle and Kelly are both regulars, and we have some very, very aggressive regulars when it comes to the trivia contest. They really like to wrap their arms around. So let me give the second question, and then we'll get back to our discussion. So the second question is, what present-day country were the abducted Africans that were aboard the ship, the Amistad, which was made into not only a book but a great movie, from? So I'll repeat that. So what present-day country were the African Americans aboard the Amistad that were abducted? So, Rick, let's get back to the English that were sent over and what their skills were and what their skills weren't, and then how the Angolans played in not only the development, but the turning around the financial investments here in America by the Virginia Colony Company, I guess that was, Virginia Stock Company. So why don't you speak to that a little bit?
Well, you know, it's interesting how the movies have romanticized who the English were. And when you look in the colonial records, you'll find out that they really have taken license. Each of the plantations were developed by captains. So they were sea captains. And the sea captains would bring a ship over with people, and many of them would stay here, and the ship would go back. The people that they brought over, again, were poor peasants. Because they were poor peasants, they couldn't read, they couldn't write, many of them couldn't compute. So their skills were very limited. But more important, they had no farming skills. They had no animal husbandry skills. They have no forestry skills. So when they brought these poor peasants here to carve out an existence, it was a very, very difficult existence for them. In fact, every time a ship came, when they returned, a third of the previous shipload had already died because of starvation, disease, the well-circulated arrowhead. So it was not a very easy existence for them. We also kind of forget what England was like in the early 1600s and what Virginia was like. Virginia was a semi-tropical climate. The summers were warm, they were hot, they were long by English standards. So because they didn't know anything about farming, the Jamestown or the Virginia colony was on the verge of bankruptcy. It was not owned by a government. It was owned by the Virginia Company of London. So it was a corporate community, and it was on the verge of bankruptcy and financial collapse. When the Africans arrived, because they were royal Africans, many of them spoke multiple languages. They understand the different skills of the trades. They were able to help them, and they came at the perfect time because what they were trying to do was to find a cash crop. And it was like a year or two beforehand that they realized that tobacco could be that cash crop. And the Angolans were able to use their skills for growing crops in a semi-tropical climate. They knew everything about animal husbandry. So as a result of it, they became big cattle farmers. That's how they acquired their land, was through the crops and through the animals. So they helped to turn the economy around. Every single plantation prior to the arrival of the Africans were on the verge of bankruptcy. A year and a half later, each of them derived a profit, and those profits based on the colonial records were a direct result of the skills and the talents brought to the colony by these educated Angolans.
Yeah, that was a large portion of the fascination I found with the book. I really didn't think about it in that context until I read the part where you're describing how these essential suburbanite English that weren't well educated, that may have had street smarts, but knew nothing about agriculture, knew nothing about animal husbandry. And they were put here and expected to make something work, and they really didn't have the skills. And then when you bring in the Africans, it augmented that whole process and made it work. And I don't think I ever read it like that before and made that connection, but it was very, very eye-opening to see that.
Well, you know, Ralph, it's interesting that you used the term that they were expected to succeed. If you look at some of those early colonial records, they really weren't expected to succeed. Many of them were prisoners, and they wanted to get them out of the jails. Many of them were homeless. They wanted to get them off the streets. Many of them were abandoned children, so they wanted to, so some would argue, particularly when you look at some of those early records, they really were not expected to succeed. They just wanted to get them out of England. England was going through its own financial crisis, and the fewer mouths they had to feed, the more it would help those that remained behind. A lot of the sick were sent here, so that's why many of them died en route, and many of them died when they came here because they were too weak when they first started. So there's a big question today whether it was really expected that they would succeed or not.
Yeah, I guess I'd wonder about if people putting at that time putting money behind that venture, you would expect that you would get a return, so, but you're right, because they were ill prepared. I don't know how they could have possibly made it work, but
well, Ralph, if I can just jump
Sure.
on one quick, you said put money behind the venture. Again, you got to remember what European society was, what European caste society was. And Europe's caste society was all predicated on land, the lords, landlords. That's where the word came from. So what they were really putting their money on was coming to this foreign land where they could acquire thousands and thousands of acres of land for very little money. So by sending these poor people over, they were dispensable. So their intent was they have these poor people cut down the trees, and they knew in short order that they would get a return on the investment because they were acquiring thousands and thousands of acres of land. And that was virtually unheard of in Europe, to be able to acquire thousands of acres of land. So, I mean, the whole concept is very different than what we were taught. But again, I don't understand why, if all of these colonial and international records existed, why our history was written in such a fashion that was no further than the truth.
Yeah, I agree. Let's take a check in on the second trivia question, and then we'll get on to talking about more of the history uncovered and what it's led to afterwards. Susan, do we have a winner?
We sure do. Kelly McConomy won. Sierra Leone is the correct answer. So she won the second, and she again was neck and neck with Michelle D'Amato. So okay. Everybody else should try to plug in and play as well. We love all of you viewers, and of course, thank you so much for tuning in. Anyway, go ahead, Ralph.
So we've got one more trivia question, but we'll hold it off for a little bit because it might be the easiest one. So you're here and things progress, and then I think as you go on in your book, one of the things that became important is that was that these African Americans were recorded, and that became a very important event. Why?
Well, again, this is something that we don't think of today. When you begin to realize that when the Portuguese went to Angola to capture this royal city, they took out the powerhouses. So the power families were the first ones to leave. They're the ones who were educated, they could read, they could write. When the Portuguese went to Cabasa, Angola, um, um, they sent back documentation to Portugal how all their governmental systems were the same as they were in Portugal. When these Angolans came here, because they were the wealthy Angolans, the educated Angolans, they knew how to use the legal system. And the legal system of Portugal and Spain was more developed at the time than the English legal system. So everything they did, they went to court. So when they had land, they went to court to make sure it was recorded. When they had disputes, they went to court to make sure it was recorded. What's valuable about that is today we can actually go to the colonial legal records and find their lawsuits. Many of their lawsuits, they name their wives, they name their children, they name their neighbors. So from a genealogical perspective, that is so valuable because you now can go back to those documents and you can find your ancestors' written words. You can find the land that they owned. You can find the cattle that they owned. You can actually find the brand of the animals that they branded their animals. So they were so much more sophisticated than the English. Now, none of us were ever taught that. None of us even knew that. But the Portuguese and the Spaniards had a very high level form of legal government. And the Angolans understood and learned that legal standards. So when they came here, now I descend from two Angolans who came here in 1619. And I started the story earlier that my family knew about all the land that we owned. So what we were able to do from present day going all the way back to 1619, we could actually find the land that they own, and it's all recorded in the colonial records. Many of those documents were actually court cases. And my grandmother's grandmother's maiden name was Goen, and we find our 14th great grandfather, where he and his wife got into a dispute over the custody of their child in 1635.
Wow.
1635, they got into a legal dispute, which created about a dozen different legal documents, and we find John Goen, and his wife's name was Margaret Cornish. We find the name of their son, Michael Goen or Mihail Goen, and we even find the name of their grandson, all spelled out clearly written in the legal records. Who would have ever thought in 2020 that, well, actually we discovered this back in the 1980s, but who would have thought in the 1980s that you would find all of this documentation going back to 1619 about your ancestors actually in the legal documents?
That's fascinating, and I can't imagine what you felt like, and I'm going to want you to talk about that as soon as we check it. Give her the third trivia question.
Okay.
Is your whole feelings as you went through this and you were able to piece all that together, and because I can't imagine what it felt like, and we all go through our own genealogy experiences. But anyway, let me give out the third question. So the last question tonight is: while Jamestown is the oldest English settlement in the United States today, what U.S. city is the oldest European settlement in the country? So, not just English. We want to include the other one. So anyway, Rick, I've done some, not as much as you, but I've done the ancestry.com and so with many family members, and we always hit these dead ends with, our lineage going back into the boot, various places, and we know where it came from before. But you've got real connection back to the earliest points in the development of the United States and the colonies here, and you uncovered some stuff. And as I described to you, history is written by the last person with the pen, and you said history is written by the person with the loudest motive. I think, kind of similar. But tell the viewers what you felt like when you started uncovering that, and you realized that African Americans back then, early in the colonies, had rights that no one would ever imagine they did. When could they go to court? When could they sue? And you found out all of that. How did you feel? And what went through your thoughts and your mind?
Well, I wish my grade school, middle school, and high school teachers were still alive, because I was not a good history student. And part of the reason is my understanding of American history was deeply rooted in my family. And when I would read certain things in grade school, middle school, and high school, I was the only kid that would disagree with the teacher, because what I learned at home, what I learned at my grandparents' house and granduncles and grandaunts, was not what I was reading in the textbooks. And I got a low grade for conduct because I was a talker in the classroom. So I was quick to say, well, that's not my understanding and that's not right. So the oral traditions in the family were very, very strong. The families were very, very close. We always got together on the holidays. So these were things that were always discussed. When I became older and I began to do my research, what I found very interesting is all of those stories I had heard as a child, I was now able to prove. Example, when a kid would come to school and say, oh, 13 of my grandfathers fought in the Revolutionary War. Yeah, Rick, sure, go ahead. Go sit in the corner. No one would ever think that an African American would serve in the Revolutionary War, let alone 13.
Right.
So once I found that out, what I also found that my ancestors, through different battles that they fought, were actually war heroes. And some of them were actually written up by the English for being the best soldiers they ever saw. So you can begin to see how I felt, where all these things that I heard my family talk about was validated. We talked about the Civil War. Now, my mother's maiden name is a rather prominent maiden name, particularly in European communities, but this was the name of my mother's family, and they were actively involved with the Massachusetts 54th Regiment, and my great-great-grandfather, 4 or 5 times removed, was in the Massachusetts 5th. He was best friends with Frederick Douglass's son as part of the Massachusetts 5th. They were part of the Battle of Petersburg. We've got the canteen, we've got the sword, we've got the flag. So when I would tell people at school this, yeah, Rick, but what I found was the story that we were told is that my great-grandfather's life was saved by Frederick Douglass, who went to Abraham Lincoln, who got him out of a hospital for fear that he would be murdered, and was put into the Richmond hospital. And now we find all this documentation. In fact, even a part of that history was in the movie Lincoln. So for me, it was very rewarding to find all these different stories that we had heard about became part of the family dinners, the family discussions, the family history lessons. To find all of this documentation as an adult, it's to find the documentation as an adult. You can't believe how rewarding that was to validate all these stories. Mind-boggling.
Yeah. You probably had a tremendous sense of validation, which I can't imagine what it was like going through that, because it'll be refreshing the more history that comes out in every area of the country, from your stories and similar stories to even things like the Kennedy assassination. I don't think we know that fully yet. And I always tell people, don't take what you read in the newspaper. Do your research. the lesson here, go to the primary source documents and find out, because that's where the truth is. It's not with somebody how they tell it to you, but you've really got to pursue it for yourself if you want to find out. But very powerful.
And Rob, I don't know if it was a sense of validation.
Mm-hmm.
Each time I found something, it was a sense of pride.
Oh, okay.
I was so proud of my ancestors to pass these stories down generation after generation. And for me, thinking of how many families lost those valuable stories over the years. And in almost every discovery, I could almost remember a family discussion where my elders sat around the table or sat around the barbecue pit where we heard these stories. I could almost visualize the story being communicated to me. And it was a sense of pride. It was a sense of joy. It was a sense. So I wanted, it really was something that overcame me, because how proud can one be to find out, number one, that you descend from such strong, powerful people, that it wasn't validation. It really was a sense of pride and ownership. And, I really tell people that American history is my family history.
Yeah, it's good. I can see the pride when you talk about it in your face and your expression. So you should be very proud of it. So do we have a winner?
We do, and you were right, Ralph. It was answered quickly, and congratulations, Michelle D'Amato. She won. She guessed St. Augustine, Florida, and the year as well, 1565. So,
wow!
Congratulations, Michelle. Thank you for watching.
Great. Well, fabulous. It's been a wonderful
show. A phenomenal history teacher, because she's good.
Yeah, and she's quick too.
Quick. She is quick.
She is.
And she'll tell you she's not using the internet. She's not looking things up. So she's got a fabulous memory, and she's good. But our viewers are engaged, and they enjoy that part of the program. So in wrapping up, what would you leave with the viewers?
I'd like to leave the viewers with how I started, that I'm an educator by training. I felt it was very important that my students learn what I didn't. I tried to bring to them a different perspective in terms of American history. I'm a businessman by vocation, so I realized the importance of making sure that we have an informed workforce, but also people informed about world history, life history, and American history. I'm an author by curiosity, and boy, was I curious as an adult, because I really wanted to find the answers to those clues. And I'm a genealogist, and I think that's really important that each of us find out who our people are, but more important, how did our people make America what it is today? I had free ancestors, but I also had enslaved ancestors. And I'm equally as proud of my enslaved ancestors, because I know that this country was built on their blood, sweat, and tears. So it's really a richness that I feel, and I'm really hoping that your audience will now rethink American history, American history, particularly for those who are of African descent. And what we learned in school, in fact, is not accurate. So I think as we go on, certainly over the next couple of years, we're all going to begin to look at American history very, very differently, particularly when now that we know that all of those rich documents exist. This isn't fake news. It's not made up history. These documents were written hundreds and hundreds of years ago, 400 years ago, and we can't make this stuff up.
Yeah, I agree. There's a lot of education that we have to continue to do, and you should always be diligent about things of the past and what you look at. One of my avocations is I sit on Society of American Baseball Researchers, and we were doing work with pre-1903 baseball players, and their stories are equally as fascinating as some of the ones we see now. And the more you can get into source documents and get newspaper articles and find out the details, you realize the kind of characters they were and how they all built the game. And it's just fascinating to just keep uncovering history in all aspects of our lives. But Rick, you've been a wonderful guest. Thank you very much. As I said, I recommend that people pick up your book, read it. You can read it casually, you can read it quickly. It's got a lot of information in there, and you can see how we could never have built America with one or the other. Everybody had to work together to get things accomplished, and we did. And so that's what makes America a great place to live. Thank you very much. And Susan?
Terrific. And Ralph, what a beautiful sentiment to end the interview on, especially tonight on election night. And let's definitely hope for improved communications moving forward for sure, between everybody and working together.
I just hope we can all get back to a place where we can have conversations civilly about topics. It'll put us all in better stead.
Absolutely. Everybody would win. Rick, what a
in
pleasure.
2 weeks.
Oh, go ahead, Rick. Sorry, Ralph. Sorry.
2 weeks, on November 17th, we have a return guest, Celia Warren, with her second book, Pushing Back Against the Storm. So I look forward to that one. And she's a very lively guest, as you know. So, great.
Terrific.
Sorry.
No problem at all. We look forward to that, Ralph. Your shows are always engaging and well run, and it's obviously you have a very devoted audience, and that's not a fluke. So thank you so much for another great show, Ric Murphy. What a pleasure to meet you and hear your stories.
Thank you, Ralph.
The book has just made it onto my to-read list. So I appreciate your time. And you gentlemen take care for this evening. And Ralph will see you in 2 weeks. And that will do it for us for ZTV Live tonight. I hope everybody enjoyed the show, how informative it was, and the power of stories being told. Tomorrow night, please tune back in here. Dr. Lauren Fisher is back with her Wellness Wednesday show. And tomorrow night, the focus of the show is the Family Focus Power Hour. So she'll have a child and family psychologist as well as another family counselor on. So please tune in tomorrow night at 7 o'clock. Don't miss that. On Thursday, we're still working on the show, and we will check our Facebook page for the notification of what's to come as soon as you can. And until we see you again tomorrow night, remember to please be kind and also be the good news in someone's life.